Okay, welcome to everyone, and thanks very much for coming out tonight. My name's Jonathan White. I'm a trustee at the Marx Memorial Library, and I'm speaking very, very briefly at the beginning just to introduce the work of the library to people before handing over to Megan Dobney, who will chair tonight's meeting. The Marx Memorial Library, for those who don't know, was set up in 1933 as part of an effort to counter rise of fascism in Europe and to provide an archive for Marxist works, for the labour movement, and to provide education for workers. And it's still doing that job. In the last few years, we've been growing fast. We've got a fantastic archives in the library of the international brigades, of printers collections, of trade union collections, an amazing collection of books, all of which is closed to you at the moment, unfortunately, but we hope to reopen as soon as possible. And our small team of dedicated volunteers are digitizing furiously throughout this period to make our resources as available as possible to the workers, the working class movement. We run a range of courses, lectures, panel sessions like this, seminars, and online education courses. I'll post details of those in the chat as we go, but I recommend people check out those and have a look. We are a small organisation and we run overwhelmingly on the work of volunteers, and we depend for a very large amount of our income on membership fees and membership. And I would encourage people, if they're not already members, to join the library. It's a fantastic organisation. We produce a journal called Theory and Struggle, which is free to people who join. If you're a member, you get first dibs on education courses, first notification about the events that we run, and lots of access to other resources as well. So I recommend that people do that. I encourage you to consider doing that. But tonight's session, I'm going to stop there. I will put the details in the chat as we go. Tonight's session is part of a two-part panel, a series of panel sessions on trade unions and the fight against unemployment. I'm really pleased that we've got Megan Dobney chairing tonight's session and a brilliant panel of speakers. I'm going to hand over to her now and disappear. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Excellent. Go away. So this is the first meeting of two, as Jonathan's just said, and we're covering tonight unions in the public sector. And unemployment, of course, makes no distinction whatsoever. I was just looking before we started about, what the latest figures are in brief. And according to the ONS, Organisation of National Statistics, 1.72 million people in the 3 months up to November are unemployed. The Office for Budget Responsibility, all lovely names, suggests 2.6 million by the middle of this year. And you'll be glad to know that there are, at the moment, 578,000 vacancies. So that's going to work out really well. To discuss all of this and more, we have a sparkling panel, which I hope you can see on your screen. We have Joe Grady, who is the General Secretary of UCU. We have Roger Mackenzie, Assistant General Secretary of Unison, and we have Professor Roger Seifert from the University of Wolverhampton. And I shall invite each of them to make some opening remarks and then we'll open it up. How we open it up is that in the bottom of your screen, you will have a chat box. And if you write in any comments or questions, Jonathan will be surveying that chat box throughout, and then we'll ping them over to me and I will distribute them to the panel. Just to let you know that this meeting will be recorded, so it will be available for other people to watch after the event. So I'm going to begin now to invite Roger Seifert to make some opening remarks. Roger.
Okay, can we hear me still?
Perfectly.
Excellent. Okay, so obviously I haven't got very long and I usually speak for at least 3 hours. So I'm only going to give a very broad outline of some of the issues. Unemployment is only going to be one of the issues because I believe you have to have a wider context. And as it's been stressed, this evening is about the public sector union. So I'm going to do 4 points: the state of the unions, the state of the members, the state of the struggle, and the state of the economy. So if we start off with the state of the unions, as those of you who are involved in the public sector are aware, there are basically 3 types of trade union operating. And this is important in terms of potential struggle and unemployment issues. Firstly, they're essentially the single occupational unions. These are for school teachers in the NEU, the NAS, UWT, and in Scotland, the EIS. Then there's obviously single profession, single occupational unions for doctors, the BMA, nurses, the Royal College of Nursing, and a group of smaller health unions organising midwives, physiotherapists, and others. And then, of course, there's the FBU, which represents firefighters. And there's the Police Federation of England and Wales, the Police Federation of Scotland. And although the Police Federation isn't a trade union, in the famous words, it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it very nearly is a duck. So although it's not a trade union legally, it does many of these functions, and it's quite a large group. So these are all closed more or less to the professions and occupations. And at the moment, there's no particular sign of job loss in those areas of any significance. Then there are 3 general type public sector unions, UCU being one, and obviously Joe knows a great deal more about it than I do, but UCU doesn't just recruit lecturers in further and higher education, it also recruits admin, technical, library and other staff. PCS, I've done a lot of work for them recently on a range of reports, and obviously they have members in the civil service, but also outside, and of course Unison. Again, Roger Mackenzie can speak far more eloquently about Unison than I can, but as you know, besides local government and health, it also recruits outside. And then there are the 2 huge general unions, Unite and the GMB, that also recruit in the public sector. So there's a lot of different unions operating in the different sectors, but they have different characteristics. And altogether, they form, of course, the majority of members now in the TUC. So this also alters the characteristics, because a lot of these professions have equal, if not more, women than men, often more ethnic minority people, and they're often more graduates. So it skews the trade union movement from its traditional base, and that is reflected to some extent in the way the TUC functions. So that's the state of the unions. If we want to go back onto the state of the membership, the members, well, in my view, pay is not a major issue at the moment and is unlikely to be. This is because inflation is low. When I say it's not a major issue, people are clearly very concerned about their falling relative pay, and it's not going to catch up anytime soon. But during periods of low inflation, then whatever the mechanism for determining pay, whether it's a pay review body or collective bargaining nationally or fragmented, makes very little difference, because there's not going to be much of a pay rise anyway. And it's going to be difficult to see how any union is going to get a pay dispute going. I also believe, and that makes this evening slightly odd, that unemployment on any scale in the public services and sector is unlikely, although there are some threats of redundancies in some sectors, but mass unemployment is not on the horizon, although I'll touch on this in my final comment on the state of the British economy. In terms of members then, we know what the big issues are. Because of COVID, it's health at work, health working not at work, and of course mental health is very important within that. There have been some major disputes on pensions, and this has caused a great deal of harm and anguish. Some are still ongoing, but basically most of those have died down. The big issues for the shop floor, on the shop floor, for workers are workload intensification, particularly with cuts in staffing, but increases for demand. Bullying and discrimination is rife. If in anything, bullying and discrimination is worse now than it has ever been in the modern era. It's absolutely shocking, the levels that we find. And it's really not, it's not a hidden problem, but it's underreported. And what is reported is significant. A lot of this is to do with bad management. I mean, Joe knows the vice chancellors in the university sector are beyond belief in their not only incompetence but in their unpleasantness. And they're overpaid, and this is reflected throughout the health service. Increasingly, these managers, whether it's Highways England or an NHS trust, are unaccountable. They pay themselves what they want, and their general behaviour is awful. And the old saying, "a fish rots from its head," is very appropriate in many of these organisations, where the bullying culture at the top of the organisation filters through, and managers all the way down feel they can have a free hand to discriminate and bully. And what about trade union facilities? Well, we know in some areas, particularly in the civil service and parts of local government, union facilities have been badly attacked, making it very difficult for shop stewards and activists to get going. On the other hand, they're also threatened by digitalization, which is not just a threat, but is also possible new jobs. And there is, of course, some redundancies in some sectors, further education, some parts of local government, and at the fringes of some of the civil service areas. We should also add that it's highly unlikely there are going to be any redundancies in the police or the armed forces under a Conservative government at the moment. So remote working is also, so there's plenty of real issues, but they're mainly from the grassroots. So if we look at the state of the struggle, we find that during the pandemic, this is an opportunity. I know people don't want to use that phrase, whatever way you want to talk about it, to reset the trade union movement in quite a positive way. For example, many unions are growing in the public services. People who previously didn't join unions are joining. The activists have grown. Zoom, even though people like me can't work it very well, I understand from 4 of my children who are all reps for the NEU that meetings have never been better attended, more people are speaking, more people are engaged, more people are active, and there's a real opportunity to bring in people under 30, which for the trade union movement is quite astonishing, into activities that we haven't seen for a long time. So these are really important opportunities. And again, my children explain to me they do this through social media. Ways of dealing with this. Well, one of the difficulties is that historically, when we've had conservative governments, whether it was in the 1930s, 50s, 80s, and more recently, the 2 major pressures, unfortunately, have not come from the trade union leadership for a variety of reasons. They've come from rank and file movements. The rank and file movements, whether it was the unemployed workers in the 1930s or the shop stewards in the 70s and 80s, are a vital part of the fight back. And I do believe that there's a greater chance now to get rank and file activism. This is particularly true with the sad departure of Jeremy Corbyn from the leadership of the Labour Party. When people see that the Labour Party is not fulfilling its promise, in other words, when they're told to wait until there's a Labour government for reform and they don't believe it, they're more likely to get active in the unions. And the other part of the struggle fight back is, of course, non-union community-based activities, whether it's around housing, which is increasing, or whether it's around green issues or other types of activity. These are very important, and historically, again, 1930s and 1970s are critically important decades to learn from on this. They fed into and from the trade union movement. So that together also bring in a lot of young activists. So we're looking at perhaps a new generation of people coming into the movement, and that's very important. And the final state I want to look at, which is more problematic but does feed more fully into the economy, is what is the state of the economy? Well, I always laugh, ho, 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 when a Tory government borrows enormous amounts of money. And when we're told just 2 years ago that borrowing this money would destroy the entire known universe and everything in it, and we're now told it's okay, guys, because low interest rates, long time borrowing. But it wasn't okay when Jeremy Corbyn suggested it, and the TUC suggest it now, but it's okay for the Conservatives. They throw all their economic dogma out of the window. But nonetheless, they still have the instinct not to do that. So what's going to happen in the post-pandemic budgets? Are they going to maintain the level of borrowing and therefore save the public services? No redundancies, more money, more buildings, and what we hear may be even slight decrease in the rate of privatization? Or are we going to go to austerity Mark II, a different type of austerity that will fall more heavily actually on small business in the private sector because of the need post-pandemic to defend the public services? So it's quite difficult. I guess at the moment, Johnson and his government are under pressure from both sides. They know politically they can't cut education, they can't cut health or social care. They'll struggle to cut back on central and local government. And they're certainly not going to cut back on the police and the military at the moment. On the other hand, they're going to have to start paying off and damping down the debt, whatever the world situation and the post-Brexit trade situations are. So where will they do that? Increased taxation is inevitable, but will they put the burden on the private sector, in which case next seminar, which will be looking at unemployment in the private sector, may be dramatic. Just on the final point about the links, of course, when unemployment grows overall, even if it's primarily falling on the private sector, those workers' demand for public sector activity grows because they're claiming more benefits, they have more problems with housing, they have more stress, mental health problems, educational problems. So right across the board, unemployment anywhere in the system increases the demand for the work and services of public sector workers. And one of that means is if they don't increase numbers, then workload will further intensify. And that seems to be the most important issue facing the public service, is actually work intensification rather than unemployment. So that would be my comments for now, Megan. Is that enough? I can say more.
There was an element of optimism there, which is always encouraging. But I am just going to make one point. As my name is Megan, you forgot to mention UCAC, the trade union affiliated to the TUC for Welsh teachers, when you were going through your...
Sorry. I couldn't mention them all. I couldn't mention them.
Well, I know. Anyway, thank you so much, and this will all come back again. Joe, may I invite you to make your contribution, please?
Thank you. Quite a good note to end on, and sort of segues into some of the things I wanted to say, really, because I tend to agree with Roger that I think the conversation that really needs to happen is not necessarily one of mass unemployment per se, or where that will be located, but actually the impact that we're already dealing with and will continue to have to fight against, which is mass underemployment. And the kind of mass expansion of precarity, how that manifests, what that means, and how we can build not just strong activist rank and file basis movements against that, but actually a rank and file kind of organising in the community against that. And I'll say a bit more about what I mean about that in a little bit. Because I think, just to sort of take it back to some Marx for a moment, capitalists and, you know, kind of transnational corporate elites have already mastered and have for decades how to extract maximum surplus value from all manner of I was going to say the labour process, but actually just making the extraction of surplus value as efficient as possible, essentially, whether that's via outsourcing, whether that's via automation, or any of the things that we know. That is as efficient as it possibly can be. So what we've seen over subsequent decades is actually the extraction of surplus value from the labour process, and how actually we use individual workers and groups of workers to generate and extract value where perhaps that wasn't possible before. And, you know, you can see within that how we can recognise and explain the consistent devaluing of wages, work intensification, equality pay gaps, and, you know, kind of justifications for them within the labour market, and why those kind of entrenched discriminations exist. All of that is the move to extract surplus value from the labour process, and not just the process of actual production. And I just think that's a really kind of important point to stress at the beginning, because it's what allows us to understand attacking pension scheme. It's what allows us to understand why we have an approach to casualised and precarious labour that has more in common with short work in the 1930s than it does with perhaps any other decade in between. It's what allows us to understand why, if we're thinking about education, highly educated people who have to train for several years can go through insecure employment contracts for longer than a decade, sometimes 2 decades. It is a deliberate choice of value extraction. And for me, that's the real important conversation, because that isn't just isolated to, say, members of UCU, whether it's in FE, HE, prisons, adult ed. You can see it throughout the public sector. I remember when I was doing research on junior doctors, people were staggered actually at how little junior doctors were paid compared to what they thought they would be, and the declining value of the salary of professionals. And I think, I don't need to go into it in great detail, but that real deprofessionalisation of really attacking what was part and parcel of, a good remuneration package. So that is not to kind of dismiss that some professions have been eroded, or that some people have been made redundant, or that some jobs have been lost in certain sectors. Just that I think mass underemployment and the extension of precarity and the real drilling down of value extraction from people as workers, whether that's through devaluing their wages, devaluing their pensions, intensifying their workloads, completely obliterating levels of the workforce and moving that work onto other people, outsourcing to the private sector at a lower cost, and removing the professionals that used to do it. All of those things, I think, are what unions have not dealt very well with, actually, in the kind of the managed decline of people's terms and conditions. And it has eroded our collective bargaining. The lowering of density of membership in trade unions has lowered their ability to demand more. I mean, I think it's quite a simple numbers game, really, in that sense. If you've only got 50% density, or you've only got 50% participation, you're only going to get 50% of what you're asking for. And I think that we haven't been able to generate kind of mass participatory action for various reasons. And again, I'll come back to them in a minute. So I think for me, one of the kind of challenges really as to how we as trade unionists, but also people on the left, people based in community organising, really need to respond to this, is to learn from unions that have done a good job actually at defending broader points about the societies they want to live in. And I'm going to just mention for a moment, in case anybody knows of Karen Lewis, who tragically died recently, who was part of the Chicago Teachers Union. She passed just recently because of brain cancer. And she was the first Black president of the Chicago Teachers Union. And she is renowned for really transforming that union, a real kind of like rank and file takeover of the Chicago Teachers Union. And she was very outspoken. She was very fierce. Like, she was an impressive individual in and of herself. But one of the things that they did in Chicago, and they won groundbreaking deals for their members, and inspired a generation of activists, is they really they went beyond just seeing their role as a union of bread and butter issues. They really grasped this idea that we will not harm our children. We will not do things that you want us to do that harm our children. So they moved beyond just a kind of a pay and benefits approach to what it is to be a teaching union. And they talked unapologetically about broader issues of social justice. Under her tenure, the union put forth a manifesto. It was called the School Chicago's Students Deserve Better, something like that. I probably misquoted it. And it really laid bare the disparity and the difference between not just how staff have been deprofessionalized and should have professional autonomy, but what not having a fully staffed school does for children and communities. So part of the I'm not sure it would be pay claims, but part of the disputes that they entered into was, we need more nurses, we need more social workers. Part of that was having capped class sizes. So they weren't just fighting for jobs of their members, but they were really broadening out to a much wider appeal. And I think that's incredibly important. And I think if you think about some of the sectors that we represent, you know, I'm just going to use higher education as an example. You know, we put in really narrow pay claims that do tend to speak to quite specific bread and butter issues, or we have traditionally. I would like to see that change. The way in which different public sector unions have different competing demands sometimes mean that imagining and capturing those broader goals and priorities can become quite bureaucratic discussions rather than actually saying this is the direction we want to go. And unions can lead those discussions, because I'm personally of the view, you know, there are no shortcuts to political change, and we can't put our eggs in the basket of expecting any politician or political party to deliver it for us. And I certainly don't think Karen Lewis did either. So I think from my perspective, if we want to prevent continuing underemployment, if we want to prevent people's roles and jobs being removed from the institutions we love that then do harm to the students or the other people that we serve, adopting a much broader social justice model is the only thing that is going to work. And that means that any notion of a servicing union has to be completely rejected. And that's fundamentally where I am. But we know not everybody always agrees with us in our unions. And I think there's a lot of organising to be done to bring people on board with that position. But the last thing I want to end with, because it wouldn't be me anything to do with Marxism if I didn't get on my hobby horse about this, is there's a real undervaluing of anything that hasn't always been seen to be part of the formal productive economy. And the social reproduction of labour is constantly erased and removed. And we see that, I think, if we look at teaching and at care, and particularly in the UK at the minute, at the people who provide a lot of care, often migrants, often women, often Black women, you know, providing serious labour that often Marxist concepts and theories does not account for. Even David Harvey, whose work I've appreciated and read for a very long time, talks about kind of social reproduction as just free gifts of nature, as if that's, you know, just something that women do. And I think ignoring that and not fully taking control and hold of what that means really denies you what Karen Lewis was doing, you know, as the first Black president of a teaching union in Chicago, of saying we need to talk about the nurses in school and we need to talk about the counsellors. And that's how you reach out to parents. So when you do withdraw your labour, and they had 90% participation and they got everything they wanted, everybody in the community is behind you, because there's not some sort of negative narrative about teachers not doing things. And I think the campaigning that we've been doing throughout this pandemic, it's not a zero-sum game. Like, obviously we want to keep everybody safe, but it's also been crystal clear that we care about students, that we care about justice, that we care about the community. I think it's one of the reasons why UCU has gained 9,000 members in the past 12 months. And it's why we will continue to gain more. But you don't do that by shrinking yourself into a space and thinking that those things don't belong to you and hoping that somebody else, whether it's the Labour Party or some other bigger union, will do it for you. So I'll probably end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo. And I think one of the things throughout this pandemic, which is not quite such a juicy Marxist point as you have been making, has been about the revaluation and the reviewing of some things that have been just assumed, the low value in some areas. Okay, then finally, Roger.
Thank you, Megan, and thanks to Roger and Jo for their contributions. I found both of them really fascinating. Few issues I want to raise. The first one is a kind of definitional type thing. You can't call Unison a public sector union because we're not. We're a public services union, and the distinction's really quite important given what Roger in particular was saying about the importance of looking at the private sector, because we've got something like 200,000 members who work for private sector companies who deliver public services. Frankly, they should be nowhere near public services at all. And unions should have done, in my humble opinion, maybe much better at stopping these private sector companies from making profits out of the public services. but that's what we have. Something like 200,000 members of Unison work for these companies. Now, part of that, it's even more, the picture is even more complicated by the fact that we have many of our members who don't work for either a private sector company, they don't work for a traditionally recognized public sector company, organization like a council or the NHS. Actually, many of them work for themselves. And that's and by the way, not really strictly allowed by our rules, but that is what is happening. Because what happens, particularly around social care, the one growing area in public services, public service delivery, social care, is that many people who work in social care are forced to set up their own companies so that they can get on the books of these agencies that deliver public services. Now that adds a whole new layer of precarity to the lives of those workers. And on top of that even, we have thousands and thousands of our members who don't see anybody else. They work on their own. They get their instructions about what jobs to do on their phone, and they get the instructions about where to go next on their phone. But where people who believe in collectivism, we want to build collective organization, because from that collective organization, we all know on this call, comes some strength. But the reality is, for many people, is that because they don't see anybody else, there's no immediate recognition of what that collective is for them. So we have to create that new sense of solidarity, that new sense of collectivism. And I think that is a real challenge for a movement that is still predominantly a servicing movement. It's not a trade union movement that is particularly been successful at developing an organizing culture within our movement. Now, one of the interesting things about that for me, and it's always been, frankly, it pisses me off really, it's something that I've seen for many, many years, is that we have these kind of fashionable kind of trends that we go through, where the trend becomes organizing this, organizing that, and everybody wants to do organizing, and we bust in experts, or fly in experts, I suppose is the correct thing, from the United States, who tell us that these are the organizing things that we should do next. Now, I'm not criticizing people from the United States who want to get off and do organizing, far from it. Anybody who wants to do organizing, I'm a fan of, frankly, and I'm willing to learn from, and I'm willing to help organize alongside as well. But there are plenty of examples of where the things that Joe was talking about, which I think is absolutely right. I mean, Karen Lewis is was a marvelous organizer, and she will be a massive miss. But she's left people behind to continue that organizing. But you know, this stuff isn't new. There have been people across, particularly across those countries that were colonized by the British, who have been doing this organizing that encompassed more than pay and rations for many, many years. The most obvious example is COSATU, frankly, and the work that they did, which wasn't just about pay and conditions, but it was a part of a liberation movement. And you got no choice of being part of a liberation movement when someone's boot is on your neck. And frankly, for many of our members at the moment, there is a boot on their neck, or let me put it differently, there is a knee on their neck, right? If you understand what I'm saying there, right, in terms of a knee on someone's neck, because there's much of this is the kind of racism that both Roger and Joe illustrated as well, where many of the people who are working in these really precarious areas, Black women in particular, are, because we are so badly organized in many of these areas, they are being left to the unscrupulous behavior of many of the employers that pay the pittance of a wage that many of them have to tolerate. But part of that toleration that they have to put up with is also the fact that many of them have to do more than one job to survive. many of them are having to do 2, maybe 3 jobs as well. And I think that puts another complicated layer on top of the questions of what are we really talking about in terms of mass employment. Mass unemployment, because I do tend to agree with what's being said that it's a more complicated picture than that, because I think that many of our members in Unison certainly are simply struggling to survive. They're struggling to keep a roof over their heads, and they're struggling to put bread on the table, literally. And that's why they have to do 1, maybe 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to get by. And this is no small thing. So for them, it seems to me, unemployment is a very real issue. Because, and it's not that you lose 1 job and you lose all your income. You lose 1 job and you literally are struggling to find where your next meal is coming from, even though you've still got work. And I think, so that maybe talks to the points that both Joe and Roger raised about employment maybe. But I think these are really serious issues for us to deal with. I want to say something because I do agree with what Roger said about the importance of fighting discrimination at this moment in time. I think there's some real issues that we're seeing across the public services. We are seeing jobs being threatened across public service jobs that we organise. We've seen lots of threats of job losses. What we see on top of that is that many of these jobs that are going or being threatened to go are jobs that Black workers have fought long and hard to get into. I remember when I first started in local government as a housing trainee back in Walsall in the West Mids in the early 80s. Hardly a Black worker in local government, hardly a Black worker, certainly in our area, hardly any. Grew over the years, not because somebody somehow all of a sudden became benevolent towards us and thought, poor Black people, let's give them a job. It came because we fought, not just the employer, by the way, but often the trade unions to stand up and organise and fight for Black workers who were unions quite happy to take our money, but not so happy to stand up and fight for the discrimination that we were experiencing. And that's why we had to self-organise in so many cases. And I still think that Black self-organisation for Black workers is a key part of the fight back that we have to consider. But what we are going to see is we are absolutely seeing the jobs that we fought for many years to get Black workers into public service jobs under threat in the public sector part of the public services. Now, I've already said about what happens with Black workers in the private sector part of the public service delivery. They are the most vulnerable, absolutely, because they are not only being asked, as I said earlier on, to form their own companies so that they can get work within those places, but they are working for people who are instructing them to come to work during the COVID. If you don't come in and sleep in at these care homes, you can forget coming in tomorrow. You will lose your job. And by the way, you may lose your migrant status as well. We are hearing from many of our members who are refusing to take the vaccine against COVID, refusing to take the vaccine because they see no action being taken to come to terms with why so many Black people have experienced COVID more than anybody else. But they're also being threatened by their employers. If you don't take the vaccine, you will lose your job. And these are real concerns that the trade union movement has to stand up and do something about. So the question for me is, what do we do about these things? Because we can talk about it forever. For me, I'm an organiser. I think organising is the key. We have to move beyond allowing the trade union movement to duck this question of the need to build our movement anymore. We will make no progress, in my eyes. We make simply no progress unless we build that organising, not just culture, but the structures that are needed to be able to give power to working people in the workplace. Not for us officers just to be able to come in and represent people. or for do it, or to do the work for people, but to build real power that's going to give people a real sense of their own agency and their own strength within the workplace. So for me, I think that we are going to see major job losses within the public sector. I think we are going to see major job losses within the private sector that shouldn't be in the public service delivery, but is at the moment. I think we are going to see those job losses, but we're also going to see those people who are under threat because of the precariousness of their jobs, but also because of the temporary employment nature of their jobs, the self-employment nature of their jobs. It brings about a whole sense that these people, these workers are disposable at will. And I think these are major challenges for us as a trade union movement when we're looking at how we try and fight back against these things. If we're not in a position to build power in the workplace for those workers, then we are not in a position to fight back. So for me, it follows that organising working people into stronger trade unions, into stronger activity is the key. I'm proud to see my brother, Kevin Nelson, on this call, as well as somebody who's been at the forefront of that fight for us in Unison in the Northwest, and understands the need to build a strong organising infrastructure within the region. I think that's something that we need to roll out across, absolutely roll out across the rest of our union, and I think the rest of our movement too. For me, we can talk about all this stuff, but for me, it's what we do to build a movement that's going to bring about that fundamental change that working class people need at this minute. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Roger. I was particularly interested because it's something I'm always focusing on, is this linguistic nonsense with the public sector and the public service. And I know that the Labour Force survey, which provides a lot of information for anybody, including trade unionists, when they survey people, they ask them which sector they work in. And of course, you know, if you, for instance, are a refuse collector, you probably think you work in the public sector because the work you do is for a council paid for by the ratepayers. In fact, you're employed in the private sector by Veolia or somewhere. So the distortions are an enormous start. And as Roger says, it's the information we actually have in unions that we should be using. Right, I'm going to move on. I've got a first question, which I'll take an indication from the panelists who'd like to go in first, which I think to a degree builds on some of what has just been said. And it's from Steve, and he's just mentioning about the gradual move over the last decades towards individual employment rights, if I'm not mistaken, particularly thrust forward by Tony Blair, and asks what the panel sees as opportunities now that we've left the EU in moving back towards collective employment rights. I don't know who's got a fancy to comment on that. I hope somebody has. That would be a no then.
Well, I mean, if I can, because I mean, for me, what I was talking about in terms of the whole, and I think we were all talking about actually in terms of the whole service model of trade unionism, is an individualistic model. I mean, it's not about trying to build collectivism, not about building strength within the workplace. What it's about, for me, is about just responding to a particular individual circumstance that a worker has got into, and can the union provide a service for them, either through a solicitor or provide them with a free will or provide them with some insurance or something, and that's the extent of it. And that you know, that might help that one individual person to deal with that one particular circumstance that they might find themselves in, but it doesn't necessarily do anything to build collective power within a workplace. And I think that's what we need to be looking at. I've got no problem, by the way, in terms of giving people support and protection and making sure their issues are dealt with in the workplace. Of course not. But we have to look at how you can maybe turn some of those individual issues into collective issues as well. And I just think that quite often you don't see an attempt to do that. And I come from a background where I think that trade unions are about collective organisation and collective power in the workplace, and I think there's a whole bunch of other people who don't necessarily agree with that.
I think so. You're nodding, Joe. Did you want to add something? Put you on the spot.
I think Roger did quite a good job. I guess the only thing I would sort of say to accompany what he just said is that strong collective rights are delivered by strong collective groups of people. And at the minute, I think we have a lot of work to do. I want to kind of fully endorse a lot of what Roger said towards the end of his talk about organising. And, you know, you could pick numerous examples from what Roger just gave, and protecting each other, of people coming together and organising to protect. It's not about a kind of, for me, more structural issues of are we part of this kind of legislative regime or that. You know, we change legislative regimes that we don't like by actually campaigning for it and working together and reaching out. So more nodding in agreement, not much more to add, really.
Thank you very much. There's a question that follows on to a degree from Pete Middleman, and I think he's been the victim of a bit of you know, automatic texting, because he is asking if full enjoyment is still our goal, but I'm imagining he means full employment.
Full enjoyment is absolutely my goal. That's what I stand for.
So that's it. Thank you all for popping by. We'll be off. His comment is around the fact he's saying the failure of Corbynism to deliver working class advantages. And he's putting that in the context of Brexit. How much of the community organising, I seem to be echoing something dreadful. How much of the community organising challenge will rest on a renewed programme of political education? Roger, you just look like you ought to be the man to deal with that. Thank you.
Me, yes, Roger.
Sorry. Yes.
Okay, no, it's okay. Well, yeah, full employment is our goal. I mean, I'm currently been asked, and I'm currently doing the second volume of the history of the Transport General Workers Union, which deals with the 1930s up until 1945. So I've been reading a great bit about the Beveridge Report and the importance of full employment in the 1945 government. And there's no question that unemployment in all its forms, whoever's involved, is an absolute disaster for the individual, the community, the sector, and everything else. It couldn't be worse. I mean, people talk about, as Roger did, in work poverty, but out of work poverty is even more desperate and despairing. One of the key cornerstones of all labour movements and all labour parties and all communist parties is the importance of finding work for everybody. Now, we know it matters what sort of work, proper pay conditions, decent jobs, and so on. But unemployment is the worst scourge of all the working class, whatever the circumstances. So it has to be an absolute priority that it's still our goal to have full employment. And it is also the case, as we know, and as Joe raised the spectre of communism throughout Europe, I think that Marx is relevant in the notion that when you have unemployment in any sector, it puts pressure on wages and bargaining in all other sectors. So any unemployment has a bad impact on those in work as well. And it's this unity that matters. So really, I think we have to be very careful. Firstly, full employment is a major factor. Secondly, you can only get it through public sector ownership and planning. And we know that if you leave it to the market, you will get periodic periods of terrible unemployment, destructive, random, and unexpected. But the impact is always the same. So in terms of Corbyn and what he did and didn't do, I think what we have to remember is it was raising the issues to the top of the agenda. More than anything else, I mean, we don't want to personalize it with Jeremy Corbyn. What the left, when they had their moment in the limelight, were able to do was bring hugely important issues for all working class people to the top of the agenda and push the concerns of everyday chitty chatty politics down it. But the other thing that his period in office did was the question of class unity, that above all else he saw and he recognized and he reminded all of us that it is class unity beyond gender, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation. It doesn't matter. The point is, if we have class unity, we have class struggle, and that dividing public and private sector workers against each other, dividing unions against it, divide and rule is the hallmark of the British ruling class beyond any other tactic that they've developed. And horribly, it works rather well. And it works better when there's mass unemployment. The worse the unemployment is, the easier it is to divide people, to turn people on incomers, newcomers, foreigners, aliens, the professions, the whatever you want to call it. And therefore, getting rid of unemployment does everything we can hope for in the labour movement. It has to be our top priority for everyone's health and well-being, for equality. Nothing else can really be launched if we have mass unemployment and the struggles that are involved. So of course it has to be. And I don't think we should blame Corbyn or go over the board about what he did and didn't do. The key thing is he represented class unity and class struggle in a way that has rarely been represented in the national debate in this country.
Thank you.
Could I say something? Because I think I just want to say something about the kind of Corbyn element of the question, because I think what we had up until Corbyn's election as leader was a really destructive, disappointing, like discursive vacuum of nobody talking about anything better, you know, and nobody talking about aspirations. He really dragged the conversation as to what people could expect and raised expectations and started a national conversation that had not been happening for a very long time and that Labour had had absolutely no interest in being a part of. And I don't think you can really underplay how important that was, regardless of whether or not it delivered anything. And I think if we look, you know, part of the questions that we were given to sort of prepare for this seminar was to take a historical perspective. The Beveridge report bust open what people thought was possible to be delivered by the state. It created a discursive space in the 1940s that delivered a mass message to the population at large about things that they could expect and demand from a post-war Britain. Those things are incredibly important. And I think if you look back at British history, we've had pockets of what has appeared possible being very constricted by moments of discussion where actually things become a bit more open. It's disappointing that the leadership that's preceded Jeremy has chosen to try and shrink that conversation back down again. But I think that's really, really important, and not to sort of dismiss it. The only other thing I just want to say, because I broadly agree about the point about full employment, is just to sort of go back to what I was saying. There's good jobs and bad jobs, but I do really worry as a feminist that we have to be careful about adopting a really kind of heteropatriarchal view of the employment relationship and actually what that means and whose labour is valued and what is excluded from that. And obviously you could get into conversations about a universal basic income, you could get into conversations about the value that is placed on people's labour and whether that's part of the formal economy or not. But I think all of that is part of like the broader conversation about employment itself and about who does what and how we value it. And I don't think we should shy away from having those conversations either when we talk broadly about these topics.
Thank you.
Megan, can I just quickly jump? I mean, I don't want this to obviously turn into just a discussion about Jeremy and stuff, but
no, absolutely.
But to be fair, I mean, the guy did have most of his time trying to deal with backstabbing bastards who were trying to get him out of his job, you know, and you know, and even with that, he's managed to raise all these issues to the forefront that were never at the head of Labour's agenda. And I think that's a remarkable achievement, especially given some of the people who that he was trying to deal with, frankly.
Okay, well, I'm going to just shift us slightly towards the practical trade union responses that are intimated in three questions that have come in. The first one is a practical trade union response to the change in profile of the economic position, the economic and social importance, if you like, of groups of workers that were completely, not by us naturally, but completely undervalued. And as an example, we could say shop workers or care workers. So, you know, key workers suddenly became people who weren't necessarily working in a steel factory. A second question about what can trade unions practically do is talking about the dispersal of people who were local government workers, but are now randomly scattered, as has been mentioned, across a wide range of different companies who are contracted. What can unions do in terms of structures to improve and increase organisation there? And then the final one, which is a comment about one of the starting points that we adopted from Bob Oram 23 years ago. The TUC Organising Academy was established, but since then, I don't think he's saying that this is the necessarily all to be laid at the feet of the TUC, but there are now less stewards, less organised branches and workplaces across the workforce in all unions. Why is that? So it's really about practical points for trade unions and what can be done. Who'd like to go on that? Jo?
I'll start because I'll say something about the last one. I mean, I don't personally agree with the point that was just made at the end, at least not about my union, our union, UCU. We have more organised, stronger branches now than we did at least 12 months ago. And I think than we did 12 years ago. You know, we recently put 400 UCU activists through an organising school. It was a 6-session, 6-week school. We're going to be putting more through when it runs again. We run it again in May and June. We've been putting on, you know, all manner of organising workshops around health and safety. Even in prisons, you know, really hostile, aggressive employers. We've recently just run an indicative ballot, the first we've ever run in prisons for members to take action there in a privatised employer. So I think maybe just because we don't always see it doesn't actually mean that the kind of rank and file organising and activism that keeps people safe on the ground isn't happening, because I think it is. But, well, I can only really speak about UCU, it definitely is. And I'm kind of really trying to lead from the front in terms of saying, you've got to roll your sleeves up and do this. Like, no one's going to come in and protect you. But I think to sort of go back to something Roger was saying at the beginning, there are no shortcuts to this. It takes time, it takes graft, it takes people who are really invested in change and also who really understand their sector and their members and their hopes and fears and what their working lives are like and what their workplaces are like and what their communities are like to do that. You can't replicate that by sort of picking someone out and throwing them into an organising academy. Like, I fundamentally believe unions are at their strongest when they're really quite sectorally specific, or at least specific to a kind of a profession and an identity. And they have people working within them, whether that's the General Secretary or others, who give a shit about that profession, you know, who really care, who really get the transformational, for me, power of education, you know, who comes from a tradition of understanding that and how you reach out to people who might think, or aren't education workers all privileged, or, you know, whatever the kind of the narrative is. So I think you can do it, and there are unions that are doing it. You know, I would point to ours. And I think to go back to what I was saying about the Chicago Teachers Union, you know, trying to organize in those bits of your sector that have been privatized and have been outsourced has to be a priority. You can't just manage the decline of people going into them and hope they get taken care of by someone else. It's our responsibility to clean up the mess that maybe people made before. And that's kind of what we do all the time if we're organising. So I kind of wanted to challenge the narrative a little bit, really.
Thank you. Anyone want to pick up any of the other points?
I'll just make a comment, if I may.
Yeah.
About guarding against one size fits all. I mean, I've been, as I said, doing quite a bit of work for PCS, and I visited the DVLA in Swansea, 6,000 people in one building, a workplace branch of about 3,000 for the PCS. And organising there getting the message across, finding activists, running a committee, putting pressure on the management is very difficult, but you do have large numbers in one place. I mean, they've suffered terribly from a COVID outbreak, quite disgracefully. But other parts of the PCS, where I've just finished a project for them in the Ministry of Defence, they've got like 500 different workplaces with about 3 or 4 people in each workplace scattered over a massive geographical area. The teacher unions, primary schools, have only 3, 4, maybe 8 members at most in thousands of different workplaces. So there's a contrast between the different types of unions. And as Joe says, they've grown up with a tradition, and the tradition isn't accidental. The tradition is to do with the reality of the way their sector is organized, the management, the employers, and we have to take account of that. There mustn't be a top-down, one-fits-all size type of approach to this. We have to have more faith and trust, rank-and-file activists who are on the ground, fighting day in, day out, in contact with their networking colleagues to come up with the better way of doing it. And that's very important. And we do have a generation of trade union leaders, 2 of whom are with us, who are quite different from their predecessors. They're far more willing to listen to rank and file. They're far more willing to embrace organizational flexibility and change. And as Roger McKenzie quite rightly pointed out, the importance of that when it's driven by a fragmented labour market. And I mean, that raises the question also of individual contracts. It's not the law, it's not the contracts that change the world. It's the nature of employment that changes it, the way in which capitalist enterprise fragments, privatizes, changes ownership, moves around capital and people as if they don't matter, that actually drives forward the way in which we organize and think about things. And that's why the pandemic is a extraordinary event in our history. And it enables the unions, if they're prepared to be flexible, to reset the entire agenda. And as been said, workers previously ignored in dark corners have now come to the forefront, and that has to be capitalized on by everybody. We can't have any more in this country elite workers in elite unions, often male dominated, trying to take over the TUC and Labour Party policy. It has to be reversed, and now is a unique historic opportunity for that to take place, and it has to come from grassroots. Yes, I believe that.
Yes,
absolutely. And can I jump in on Bob Orham's question, because and also Nigel Flanagan's put a kind of one that's related to it as well, because I think these are really, really important questions about how we move from notions of organising that seems to have predominated around the movement for many years, and actually really doing something that makes a difference, that really changes the paradigm a little bit. I mean, I'm suspecting that when Bob was on our national executive, he was part of the decision making that decided we wouldn't take part in the TUC organising academy. And when you look at what the organising academy tries to do, it's quite interesting. I'm not particularly criticising it. It's a way of doing things, but you have to examine whether it's brought about any real change. So they train people over a 3 years, I think it is, period, who then placed in unions. So that sounds to me like a bit of a job creation scheme rather than building strong union organisation necessarily, because those people have, tend to get lost within the union structures. Now, many people who've gone through the organising academy have gone on and done great work, great organising within the movement, within the unions that they've gone to, but it hasn't changed the movement. It hasn't changed the fundamentals of what's going on within those areas. So for us in Unison, I can only talk for us, what I know is that even though we're not we haven't ever been part of the TUC Organising Academy, we are really, really challenged in terms of the number of people within our union who do anything within the union. And I didn't call them activists, but just literally do anything within the union. There's just not enough people. If you haven't got enough people doing stuff, then you haven't got enough people to be organisers on the ground that are going to make a difference with some of these terrible employers that we've got out there. So it seems to me that's where individual unions have to invest the time, the money, and the commitment throughout the whole organisation to provide a real organising approach to their work. Now that means you start from the premise that we are an organising union. It's easy to say, but if you start from that premise, then every part of the union, including the finance department, their first decision is how can they support organising, or it should be, right? Every single part of the union should be, how can we help the union to grow? How can we help our members to be more powerful within the workplace? Not how can we save the money, or how can we stop people from doing stuff that's necessary to build the union? But it starts from the premise of organising, and that comes from the union deciding that is our approach. And that's where I come from on all this, a starting point that organising is the key to building power for working people in their workplace. And then you target some employers and you go after some of these people who are making the lives of our members and people who should be our members an absolute bloody misery every day, right? And we go after them and we build strength within those organisations. Because all I see, I see loads of people who are the most vulnerable workers at the minute, who've got no union in their workplace. And one of the things that we're doing on social care, national organising target for us is social care and some of the big employers within social care. It's challenging, of course it's challenging, but there's people on this call who will tell you have to put the resources into it, and you have to target these employers, and you have to be relentless about going after them, and then and you reappraise where you are when you've spent some time going after these employers. And if you if you need to change the way that you do things, then that's what you do. But it must be a union priority where the resources are put in to bring in about real change. And that's how we raise the density levels. When Joe mentioned earlier on about 50% and stuff, I was like, I wish, I wish, hardly anywhere in Unison where we've got 50% density, hardly anywhere, and that's tragic, frankly, because we get real change, as Joe has said earlier on, we get real change when we do get to those kind of density levels, but you only get to those density levels when you build power from the ground up. It doesn't come any other way.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just say one quick thing, because sorry to jump in, but I just think it's really, really important, and it kind of links something everybody's been saying, and it links back to what Roger was saying. A lot of the time, I think trade union leaders are scared of their rank and file, and we fetishize and credentialize organising. And I'm not making a comment here about the TUC Organising Academy because I don't really know anything about it. But the idea that you have to do like 3 years to be an organiser is absurd to me. This is like, organising sometimes is instinctive, and I'm not saying that there aren't kind of like tools that you can learn to make you a better, more effective organizer, or learn how to have like conversations with people to bring them on board. But I feel that there is sometimes a real kind of gatekeeping of credentialism around organising and around the things that build movements, because actually people are quite scared of their rank and file, and they're quite scared of activists, and they're quite scared of actually what could be unleashed if you do make people feel really empowered in their workplace. And not to sort of a really very quick anecdotal story about me is when I was in the School of Business at Leicester, that is now currently up for redundancy, they're trying to close it down because it's where all the union activists are. We had 95% density. We could do whatever the fuck we wanted because if they tried anything, we were all over. We didn't even have like a separate mailing list. We just used to email everything. Management would be in there. And like, there's no way that we would have been told by anybody that we needed to go on a course to learn how to organise, because we knew what we were doing and we understood our conditions. And I just really wanted, as like the general secretary in this chat, to make that clear that like, I don't earn anything, other people don't earn anything, our members and workers earn it, and our best job is to make them feel empowered and confident enough to do stuff and not rely on like the green light or the go ahead from me or from anyone else.
I have to say as well, in my experience, and I don't disagree with much of that, but in my experience, it's not just scared of the rank and file. There's a load of people who are scared of organisers, because when you let organisers loose in a workplace to do the business that we all know organisers should be doing, then you're losing a little bit of power, actually. right? And some people are not comfortable with that. And I think we have to give some, give some kind of scope to organisers to get on and do the job and build power for working people, to boost people, empower people. And there's a whole bunch of people who are not particularly interested in that, frankly.
Well, I'm going to just, this might be the last question, I don't know. It's from CAD, and it's a completely different area to the content of the last few comments, and which is, it's a wider question which makes me feel of a certain age, because it takes me back to the 80s. CAD saying, is the time now right to push for the redistribution of working time, and with it redistribution of wealth, as a way of dealing with both underemployment and intensification of work? I mean, I think this is so relevant at the moment, because when I was working in the printing industry many years ago, we had massive campaigns for the 35-hour week. I mean, now I barely meet anybody who, I'm not talking about within the printing industry, but anywhere who works 35 hours. You know, the lucky people work 36, but the rest of them are doing 39, 40, 45, 48, because they've signed away any protections that they had. And it is the outcome of lack of organisation. But would this be a fruitful area of work to take this forward? Nah, can't be asked. No.
Yeah, I mean, I will give a very quick answer. And it kind of aligns with what I was saying at the beginning. The idea, let's take platform workers or even, academics, anyone who works. The idea that you have to constantly be available now is actually part of the pressure of performativity in the workplace. So actually, that lends to precarity, and people who are in precarious working relationships, have to kind of perform to try and get some patronage. So the idea actually that you would have a structured conversation around time and what is a reasonable working week and what does that look like and how is that remunerated, I think that would be a really absolutely central thing for the union movement, a decent working week, a decent salary, and the Labour Party to get behind. And I think that lots of people, I think this is what's really annoying about, speaking from my perspective, the kind of political terrain of the left at the minute, that I think there are some serious kind of social justice, but also industrial bread and butter issues that would really resonate with people all around the country, but they are not being articulated in a coherent way. And people who could really shift the national conversation are shying away from it because they want to make sure that everything is safe and accepted without going out on a limb. And this would be a key thing. It links to pretty much what Roger was saying earlier about full employment. It links to what I was saying about valuing social reproductive labour and not just performative labour in the economy. You wouldn't necessarily use this language in a national campaign, but it's stuff that everybody would understand, from a granny who's looking after her grandkids so her daughter can do 3 jobs to everybody else. Yeah, I'd be up for that.
Okay, well, I'll expect it to be on the agenda then of the TUC, where it will be taken forward smoothly and successfully.
I mean, for me, the question sounded remarkably like Clause 4, Part 4. Which was always the part of the Labour Party that I came from. So I'll be quite happy to see much more done around those things.
Okay, right. Any final comments? There is a comment which you might be interested in from Kevin Nelson, just asking for comments on the impact of the 2016 Trade Union Act in terms of large strikes, large-scale national strikes. And he does say, notwithstanding the success of some of the UCU actions and so on. Anybody like?
I mean, I potentially have controversial views on this. Like, I don't agree with the 2016 Act at all. And if you look at its original manifestation, it wanted to really clamp down on all manner of freedoms, just stuff, right? So I'm not speaking in favour of the 2016 Act at all. But from an organising point of view, you need to be getting 70, 80, 90% turnout and participation in your ballots, because your ballot is a campaign. So like, I'm not denying it was clearly and still acts as a barrier to people taking action. But if you want successful action that's going to deliver big results, like 50% is a flaw, you know what I mean? That is not a ceiling for what you're wanting to get. But yeah, at a time when industrial action was an all-time low, it was clearly an attack on the trade union movement and all of the other stuff that was in it. So.
Yeah, so if I could just make a brief comment on that. I think as we know, that particular legislation was driven from the Conservatives in the London Assembly around the RMT, to a lesser extent the FBU as well. And it was absurd because the RMT and the FBU always going to meet the threshold. That's how they function. What it did do was dampen down, particularly PCS, national pay campaigns. But its impact has been limited, and it's basically redundant now. I mean, no one's interested in that side of it. If the unions are strong enough and the unions are large enough, then they will strike irrespective of that legislation. It's really not relevant, but it does link into the general position, which, if we may comment, which is to do with, the attack on workers' rights. I mean, what exactly is it? I mean, it's when we talk about workers' rights, we're talking about, as we said, collective rights, individual rights, but rights of workers to their normal life, to a right to life. It goes deeper than that, as Joe and others have been saying quite clearly. It goes way beyond the workplace. This is an attack not on workers' rights, in my view. This is an attack on the working class as a class. And it's deliberately done to divide, to split, to weaken. And there's a purpose. It's not stupid. It may be sometimes careless, but it's not stupid. What it is about is creating a world in which large corporations can make massive profits and deliver those profits in the form of dividends to their owners all over the world in tax havens so they don't have to pay it, and then to come back and hammer us further by cutting back on public services, what used to be called the social wage as well. So this is an all-out class attack by the capitalists or the people representing them, and whether they've got a Johnson face or a Trump face or a Macron face, it doesn't really, or Modi face, it doesn't matter who these people are. What matters is what they are. And what they are is representatives of an increasingly vicious and powerful capitalist class that are doing everything they can to push workers down. And as more they push workers down, the more we get the re-emergence of fascism, racism in a much cruder way, the more we see the subversion of the state, the more we see the subversion of state institutions and democratic institutions. And this is a dangerous moment, as we know, not just in this country, but across the world for this. And the only possible way back is for a united working class response. The trade unions are a major part of that. But today has been important in reminding us the need for the unions to reach beyond the workplace, into the homes, into the protests, into the Black Lives Matter movement, into all of these other movements, because they have to create some sort of movement. It is called the labour movement, but it rarely moves. And we've got to get back the movement into it, and we've got to push it forward. And it can only come from the grassroots. And as I said at the very beginning, there is serious optimism now amongst younger people. At one point, and Roger McKenzie knows this full well, people under 24 weren't bothered. There was almost the notion that there was a break in trade union tradition. That has changed now dramatically with climate change, the pandemic, and a range of other factors. Young workers, whether they're organized or not, are more and more concerned with what's going on. This is a unique opportunity to bring younger workers in. And by doing that, we actually reactivate older workers who have fallen by the wayside and given up. So this is a tremendous opportunity to move forward, but it has to be done on the basis of unity. It has to be done on the basis of respect for everybody fighting their battles wherever they are and whoever they are. And it has to be done on the basis of internationalism as well as in terms of individual workplaces. And it seems to me that's important. We mustn't get bogged down with individual legislation. We mustn't even get overly excited about 4-day weeks. I mean, as Joe knows, as a professor, I've been doing a 2-day week most of my life anyway. So, I don't want a 4-day week. That would be a disaster for people like me. But generally speaking, we've got to don't get bogged down. Or for some workers, they don't want a 4-day week. They want a 6-day week. You know, we just have to take the realities from the grassroots up and build it. And I do think we have a generation of trade union leaders unique in our history who are prepared to listen and work with that and build it and push it. The TUC has been, in my view, slightly sluggish in taking up the call, but overall the unions are doing a great job. And I think this is a moment in our history where we can really kick on. We cannot wait for any form of Labour government. We cannot wait for them. We have to do it for ourselves.
Thank you. Any final comments? You have 30 seconds each if you wish them. In which case, I'm going to thank you all. I think the watchword is beyond the workplace and beyond the nation and forward together. Thank you to Joe Brady, Roger Mackenzie, Roger Seifert, to the Marx Memorial Library for hosting. This enjoyable evening will be available on their website at some point, so you can go back to it and watch it over and over again. Thank you to everybody who has joined us this evening. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Chair.
As always.
Cheers, everyone. Take care.
I probably won't be able to leave the meeting now. I've enjoyed it. I'll be here tomorrow morning.
just keep talking, Roger. Just keep talking. It's all recorded, remember?
I know. I don't mind if there's no audience.